Her stepfather sold her because of infertility until the Alpha King chose her. Silvara stood on the auction block, shackled and cataloging every noble's weakness, because her stepfather had just sold her like livestock for being infertile. Then Kael'thur Ryvek, the warlord they called the Coldblade, paid 2,000 gold crowns for a barren bride no one else wanted, and her stepfather's smug grin cracked, because he'd just armed his greatest enemy. 3 assassination attempts, 1 kingdom-wide conspiracy, and a crossbow bolt to the shoulder later. Silvara isn't the victim anymore. She's the hunter. They whispered barren and worthless as Silvara's stepfather auctioned her off, but none of them knew she'd spent 2 years memorizing his conspiracy networks, poison methods, and corruption schemes. Lord Kael'thur bought her not for heirs but for intelligence, and within days she'd identified traitors in his council, dismantled an assassination plot, and turned herself from purchased bride into royal advisor. Her stepfather is screaming in exile, the nobles who mocked her are arrested, and the infertile girl everyone dismissed just rewrote the rules of power. Haven't subscribed yet? You're about to watch a woman go from auction block to throne room in 9 chapters. But if you're the type who reads entire stories without subscribing, you're exactly like the nobles who underestimated Silvara and ended up in chains. She survived being sold, poisoned, and shot with a crossbow. You can't even survive clicking one button? Let's see if you're smarter than her stepfather. Chapter 1 starts now. The Auction of Shadows. The auction block smelled of desperation and old timber. Silvara Quenrick stood with her chin lifted, spine straight despite the iron shackles binding her wrists. The afternoon sun filtered through Dyravel's grand marketplace, casting long shadows across the assembled crowd of nobles and merchants. Each face blurred into the next, predatory eyes, calculating expressions, mouths twisted in barely concealed disdain. She memorized them anyway. Lord Vestian, 2nd row, scratches his left ear when lying. Lady Morwith, crimson dress, favors her right leg, old injury. Merchant Pellis, 3rd from the platform, glances toward the Vestian guards every 30 seconds. Details were survival. Details were power when you possessed nothing else. The reserve price stands at 500 gold crowns, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying across the square. For the Lady Silvara Quenrick, formerly of House Quenrick before its unfortunate collapse. Unfortunate. Such a delicate word for betrayal and theft. Silvara's gaze flickered briefly to the covered pavilion where Maltherian Vade lounged in borrowed finery. Her stepfather, the architect of her family's destruction, wore satisfaction like a second skin. He'd orchestrated this perfectly, seized her father's estates during his final illness, claimed guardianship over Silvara, then sold her at the first opportunity. 500 crowns, called a voice from the left. Lord Vestian, predictably. He collected women like trophies. 600, countered a textile merchant whose name Silvara didn't bother learning. He wouldn't win. The whispers started then, as they always did. Baron, they say. What use is a noble wife who cannot provide heirs? Damaged goods, if you ask me. Silvara's jaw tightened fractionally. The physicians had confirmed it 3 years ago. A fever in childhood had left her incapable of bearing children. In a society that valued women primarily for bloodlines and alliances, infertility was a death sentence to her worth. Yet she remained standing. 700 crowns. A new voice, deep and measured. The crowd shifted. Silvara's attention snapped to the speaker, a man she'd noted earlier but couldn't fully categorize. Tall, with dark hair pulled back severely, wearing black leather armor beneath a travel-stained cloak. Not nobility, despite the small fortune he'd just offered. The calluses on his hands suggested a soldier's life, but the sharp intelligence in his gray eyes spoke of something more complex. Kael'thur Ryvek. She'd heard whispers about him. A mercenary captain turned military advisor, recently elevated to minor lordship through service to the crown. Dangerous. Unpredictable. Why would he want a barren noblewoman? Lord Vestian's face purpled. 800. 1,000. Kael'thur replied without inflection. The marketplace fell silent. Maltherian leaned forward in his seat, frowning. This wasn't the outcome he'd orchestrated. Vestian was supposed to win, a lecherous fool who'd humiliate Silvara in a loveless marriage before eventually discarding her. Safe. Controllable. Kael'thar Ryvek was neither. 1,000 crowns, the auctioneer repeated, shock evident in his voice. Do I hear? 1,100. Vestian sputtered. Kael'thar's expression didn't change. 2,000. Gasps rippled through the crowd. 2,000 gold crowns could fund a small army for months. It was an obscene price for any bride, let alone one considered damaged. Lord Vestian opened his mouth, closed it, then stalked away with his retinue. The auctioneer looked around desperately, but no other bids came. In the pavilion, Maltherian's smugness had curdled into something darker. Sold. The gavel struck wood with finality. To Lord Kael'thar Ryvek. Silvara remained motionless as guards unchained her from the platform and transferred her bonds to Kael'thar's attendant, a scarred woman with the bearing of a veteran soldier. Up close, Silvara could see the precise economy in Kael'thar's movements, the way his eyes constantly tracked exits and potential threats. Military training. Recent combat, healing scar above his collar. Favors his right side. Left-handed. My lord, Silvara said quietly, her first words since mounting the block. You've overpaid significantly. One dark eyebrow rose. Have I? Everyone here knows I cannot provide heirs. My value as a political marriage is negligible. You could have won with half that sum. Perhaps I'm not interested in heirs. Kael'thar's voice carried a hint of amusement. Or politics. Then what are you interested in? Strategic assets. He gestured to his attendant. Captain Mira will escort you to my estate. We'll discuss terms this evening. Terms. Not expectations or demands. Silvara filed that away as Kael'thar turned to complete the financial transaction with the auctioneer. As Captain Mira led her toward the waiting horses, Silvara passed close enough to Maltherian's pavilion to hear her stepfather's low growl to his companion, a thin man in scholar's robes she recognized as Vade's personal advisor. Ryvek will destroy her faster than Vestian ever could, Maltherian muttered, lips barely moving. The man's a war hound who'll discard her the moment she proves inconvenient. This will be delicious. The advisor nodded. And when he does? We'll be positioned to reclaim what remains of Quenrick's holdings. The girl signed nothing, owes nothing to Ryvek beyond marriage duties. When it falls apart, Maltherian's smile turned vicious. She'll have nowhere to go but back to us. Broken. Compliant. Silvara kept walking, her expression unchanged, but her mind raced. So that's your game. Maltherian had orchestrated this carefully. Too carefully. He'd expected Vestian to win and humiliate her publicly. When that failed, he'd already pivoted to a new strategy. Let Kael'thar Ryvek's reputation destroy her credibility, then reclaim her as a warning to others who might question Vade's authority. But Maltherian had made one critical error. He'd underestimated both her and the man who'd just purchased her freedom, or perhaps her chains, depending on perspective. Silvara climbed onto the waiting horse, her shackled hands gripping the pommel. As Diravel's marketplace faded behind them, she began calculating her next moves. Survival first. Information second. Revenge could wait. But it will come. Chapter 2. Arrival at the Northern Fortress. The cold arrived on the third day of travel. At first, it crept in gradually, a bite in the morning air, frost coating their bedrolls at dawn. By the time they crossed into the northern territories, winter had become absolute. Snow fell in thick curtains, and the wind howled through mountain passes like something wounded and furious. Silvara wrapped her inadequate cloak tighter and said nothing. Captain Mira rode beside her, a silent presence who seemed entirely unbothered by the plummeting temperatures. The woman hadn't spoken more than necessary since they'd left Diravel, offering only terse instructions about when to rest and where to sleep. The rest of Kael'thar's escort, 6 soldiers, all bearing the same hard-eyed confidence, treated Silvara like expensive cargo, valuable enough to protect, not worth befriending. She studied them anyway. Sergeant Orel, scar through his eyebrow. Defers to Mira, without question. Young recruit, Tamsin, watches the Trillian constantly. Childhood in bandit country, probably. The twin brothers, Cade and Brennan, communicate through hand signals. Former scouts. Details accumulated like snowfall. On the 5th day, they encountered other travelers at a way station, a merchant caravan heading south, desperate to escape before the passes closed entirely. While the horses were tended, Silvara stood near the fire, listening to the merchants' gossip. Heard Ryvex raising an army up there, one muttered, warming his hands. Not officially, mind you. But why else would a jumped-up mercenary need a fortress in the middle of nowhere? Maybe he's planning a rebellion, another suggested darkly. Against whom? The man just got his title. Why would he throw it away? Because he's mad. The first merchant spat into the fire. You don't earn the name the Cold Blade through mercy. They say he personally executed 32 prisoners after the siege of Cornwall. Line them up and... Enough. Captain Myra's voice cut across the conversation like a knife. She'd appeared from nowhere, hand resting casually on her sword hilt. Save your gossip for taverns in the capital, where Ryvek's reputation can't reach you. The merchants paled and found urgent business elsewhere. Mira glanced at Silvara, expression unreadable, then walked away without comment. The Cold Blade. Silvara turned the name over in her mind. She'd heard it before, whispered in conjunction with the border wars, with ruthless efficiency, with violence so calculated it resembled art. Kael'thar Ryvek had built his fortune and title on the bodies of his enemies. And she'd been purchased by him for reasons still unclear. The way station keeper, an elderly woman with knowing eyes, approached Silvara cautiously. You're the one Ryvek bought, aren't you? Yes. Advice, girl, don't try to run. Others have. Never made it past the first mountain pass. The woman's gaze softened fractionally. But don't assume you understand him either. Men like that are more complicated than their reputations. Before Silvara could respond, Captain Mira called for departure. Kael'thar's fortress materialized from the storm on the 7th day, like something from a fever dream. Built into the mountainside itself, the citadel sprawled across multiple levels of dark stone and iron. Watchtowers pierced the sky at irregular intervals, and Silvara could see the glint of weapons in guards' hands as they approached. This wasn't a noble's decorative manor. It was a military installation disguised as a residence. Or perhaps the reverse. The gates opened without ceremony. Inside, the courtyard buzzed with controlled activity, soldiers drilling in formation, blacksmiths hammering steel, messengers running between buildings. Everyone moved with purpose, and no one spared Silvara more than a cursory glance. This way. Captain Mira dismounted and gestured toward the main keep. Silvara's muscles screamed in protest as she climbed down from her horse. 7 days of riding in winter conditions had left her exhausted, filthy, and half-frozen. She followed Mira through corridors that seemed carved directly from the mountain, lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on stone walls. Servants appeared occasionally, quiet, efficient people who nodded to Mira but avoided eye contact with Silvara. She noted their worn but quality clothing, the absence of fear in their movements. Whatever Kael'thar was, he didn't rule through terror here. Interesting. Your chambers, Mira announced, opening a heavy wooden door. The room was spartanly furnished but clean, a bed with thick furs, a fireplace already blazing, a desk positioned near a window overlooking the mountains. Not a prison cell, but not luxury either. Functional. Washington rest. Someone will bring food. Mira paused. Lord Ryvek will see you tomorrow. Don't wander. You'll get lost, and the guards have orders to escort trespassers back forcibly. Understood. After Mira left, Silvara stood alone in the firelight, processing everything she'd observed. This fortress was preparing for something. The training drills were too intensive, the fortifications too serious for a newly titled lord simply establishing his household. What are you planning, Kael'thar Ryvek? She washed the travel grime from her skin with water from a basin, changed into the simple dress left on the bed, and forced herself to eat the bread and stew a silent servant delivered. Exhaustion pulled at her, but she fought it, standing at the window to study the fortress layout visible from her vantage point. Escape routes, guard rotations, weak points in the walls. Still calculating survival, she thought with bitter amusement. Eventually, exhaustion won. Silvara collapsed onto the bed and fell into dreamless sleep. She woke to darkness and the sensation of being watched. Silvara's eyes snapped open. The fire had burned low, casting the room in deep shadow. For a heartbeat, she thought she'd imagined it, but then she saw him. AlphaKingRedemption stood in the doorway, a silhouette of darkness against the torchlit corridor beyond. He hadn't entered, but his presence filled the space anyway. Those gray eyes, barely visible in the dim light, studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Not with desire, with assessment, like a predator evaluating prey. Or perhaps a general surveying a battlefield. Silvara sat up slowly, refusing to show fear despite her racing pulse. They stared at each other across the shadowed room, and she understood with sudden clarity that whatever game was being played here, it had rules she didn't yet comprehend. "Tomorrow," Kalthar said quietly. His voice carried the same controlled power as his movements. Nothing wasted, everything intentional. "We discuss why you're truly here." Then he was gone, the door closing with a soft click. Silvara remained sitting in the darkness, heart pounding, mind racing. Why I'm truly here. Not why he'd purchased her. Why was she here, as if she'd had a choice in the matter. As if he knew something about her that she didn't yet know about herself. Chapter 3. First Test of Survival. Morning arrived with a summons. Silvara had barely finished dressing when Captain Mira appeared at her door, expression as unreadable as ever. "Lord Ryvek requests your presence in the Great Hall. The council convenes in 1 hour." The council? Silvara fastened the simple gray dress, the finest garment provided, though still austere by noble standards. "I wasn't aware I'd be attending political meetings. You're Lady Ryvek now, in name if not yet ceremony. The council will want to assess you." Myra's tone suggested this would not be pleasant. "Survive the morning, and you'll understand your position here better." Survive. An interesting choice of words. The great hall sprawled across the fortress's central keep, its vaulted ceiling supported by massive stone pillars. Unlike the decorative opulence of southern courts, everything here served function. The long table positioned for strategic discussion, the maps covering one wall, the weapons mounted within easy reach. Approximately 20 people occupied the space, clustered in small groups that spoke to existing alliances. Silvara catalogued them rapidly as she entered. Military officers dominated one side, scarred veterans wearing Kalthar's colors, speaking in the clipped tones of professional soldiers. Opposite them stood what appeared to be administrative officials, their fine clothing and soft hands marking them as scholars or bureaucrats. A third group hovered near the fireplace, merchants, perhaps, or spy masters. Their eyes moved constantly, assessing everything. Every conversation stopped when Silvara entered. "Ah." A woman detached from the administrative cluster, approaching with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Middle-aged, elegant, wearing robes embroidered with what Silvara recognized as the seal of the royal treasury. "You must be Lord Ryvek's acquisition." The pause before acquisition was deliberate. "Lady Silvara Quenrick," Silvara replied evenly. "Though I confess you have the advantage. I don't know your name." "Chancellor varies. I manage Lord Ryvek's financial affairs and territorial administration." The woman's gaze traveled over Silvara's simple dress with obvious disdain. "I understand you come from fallen nobility. House Quenrick collapsed rather spectacularly, didn't it?" First test. Silvara recognized the tactic, established dominance through humiliation, forced the newcomer into a defensive position. House Quenrick was systematically dismantled through legal manipulation and theft, Silvara said calmly. "A difference lost on those who profit from others' misfortune, I imagine." Varys' smile sharpened. "Careful, girl. Accusations require proof." "I have proof. 3 ledgers documenting fraudulent loans, 2 forged deeds, and correspondence between my stepfather and certain corrupt magistrates. Silvara met the Chancellor's gaze steadily. I memorized every page before they were stolen. Would you like me to recite the specific statutes violated? Silence rippled outward. Several council members exchanged glances. You memorized financial documents? A gruff voice spoke from the military cluster. The speaker was a broad-shouldered man with a general's insignia. Why? Because documents can be destroyed, General, but memory cannot. Silvara turned to address him directly. When everything else is taken from you, information becomes your only weapon. The general's weathered face creased in what might have been approval. Before anyone could respond, the hall's main doors opened. Kael'thar Ryvek entered with the focused energy of a blade being drawn. Every eye immediately tracked to him. He wore black leather and steel, practical rather than decorative, and moved through his council like a commander surveying troops. His gaze found Silvara, held for one measured heartbeat, then moved on. Report, Kael'thar said simply, taking his seat at the table's head. The council session began with military efficiency. Generals reported on border security. Administrators detailed tax revenues and supply chains. Spymasters, Silvara's guess had been correct, offered intelligence about neighboring territories and potential threats. She remained standing near the wall, observing. No one acknowledged her presence, but she felt the weight of continuous assessment. This was theater as much as governance, everyone performing their roles while simultaneously evaluating the newcomer. And the southern merchants? Kael'thar asked, his attention on a thin man with a calculating merchant's eyes. Growing nervous about your northern expansion, my lord. They see military buildup and assume conquest. The merchant, identified as Trade Master Pelion, spread his hands. I've suggested you're merely securing your new holdings, but rumors persist. Let them persist. Kael'thar's voice carried no particular emotion. Nervous merchants are cautious merchants. Cautious merchants don't sponsor banditry on my trade routes. So that's part of his strategy. Silvara filed the information away. Kael'thar was deliberately cultivating an intimidating reputation to control economic activity in the region. If I may, Chancellor Varys spoke with practiced deference that somehow still conveyed superiority. Perhaps now would be appropriate to discuss domestic arrangements. Your recent marriage requires formalization, and there are questions about. The lady's barrenness? Kael'thar interrupted coldly. Yes, Varys. I'm aware. It's not relevant to her purpose here. The room went utterly still. My lord, Varys continued carefully, succession is always relevant. Without an heir, I have 3 younger brothers, all capable of producing heirs should I die inconveniently. Next concern? Silvara kept her expression neutral, but something shifted in her chest. Kael'thar had just publicly dismissed the primary criticism leveled against her value, and he'd done it with the casual authority that made argument impossible. Why? The council moved through remaining business, supply requisitions, personnel assignments, diplomatic correspondence. Silvara noticed patterns in how decisions were made. Kael'thar listened more than he spoke, asked precise questions, and deferred to expertise when warranted. This wasn't a tyrant's court. It was a military command structure adapted to governance. As the meeting drew toward conclusion, a servant appeared with wine and refreshments, a brief interlude before final discussions. Silvara accepted a cup gratefully, her throat dry from the room's heat. She raised the wine to her lips, then stopped. The scent was wrong. Barely perceptible, but wrong. A faint bitterness beneath the vintage's natural complexity. Silvara had spent months studying her stepfather's poison collection, learning to identify compounds by smell alone after a cousin had died from accidental contamination. This was nightshade extract. Diluted but present. Her mind raced. Setting down the cup would draw attention. Drinking would likely prove fatal within hours. Calling out the poisoning without proof would make her seem paranoid or, worse, would identify her as knowledgeable about assassination techniques. Think. Silvara turned slightly, as if admiring the wall maps, and deliberately stumbled against a nearby table. The wine cup fell, shattering on the stone floor, liquid spreading in a dark stain. "Apologies," she said quickly, kneeling to gather the fragments. "How clumsy of me." A servant rushed forward with cloth to clean the spill. In the commotion, Silvara palmed one of the larger pottery shards, evidence, if she could later test it. When she looked up, Kael'thir was watching her with an expression of sharp interest. His gaze flicked from the spilled wine to her face, and something unreadable passed through his eyes. He knows. Somehow, he understood exactly what had just happened. The council session concluded shortly after. As members dispersed, Silvara remained near the wall, scanning faces and body language. Someone had poisoned that wine specifically for her. The servant had approached her directly, offering refreshment to no one else first. Her attention snagged on a detail she'd nearly missed. Master Pelion, the trade merchant, stood in quiet conversation with one of the spy masters near the doorway. Nothing unusual, except Pelion's left hand made a subtle gesture, 3 fingers tapped against his thigh in what could have been a nervous habit. Except Silvara had seen that exact gesture used by her stepfather's associates. A signal meaning task incomplete. Her blood went cold. "Lady Silvara." Kael'thir's voice, directly behind her. She turned to find him standing closer than expected, his gray eyes studying her with that predatory intensity from the previous night. "Walk with me," he said quietly. "Not a request." As they left the great hall, Silvara glimpsed Captain Mira falling into step behind them, close enough to intervene, far enough to allow private conversation. "You recognize the poison," Kael'thir said once they'd entered a side corridor. "Not a question. A statement." "Yes." "And you know who placed it in your cup?" "I have suspicions." "No proof." Silvara met his gaze. "Your trade master uses hand signals common among Southern conspiracy networks. The same networks my stepfather employed." Kael'thir's expression remained neutral, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Interesting. You've been here less than a day, and you've already identified a potential traitor in my council. Or I'm wrong, and I've just slandered an innocent merchant." "You're not wrong." Kael'thir stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I've suspected Pelion for weeks, but I had no proof, and removing him prematurely would alert whoever he reports to." Understanding crystallized. "You wanted to see if I'd notice. That's why you brought me to the council. You were testing me." "Partially." His gaze intensified. "I was also testing them, seeing who would move against you immediately. Poisoning indicates desperation or orders from outside. Either way." A shout echoed from somewhere in the fortress. Then another. Running footsteps. Captain Myra's hand went to her sword. "My lord." A guard burst into the corridor, breathing hard. Attack on the Eastern Watchtower. Multiple assailants. Professional coordination. Kael'thir was already moving. Lock down the inner keep. Full defensive positions. As chaos erupted around them, Silvara pressed herself against the corridor wall, heart racing. The assassination attempt hadn't been meant to succeed quietly. It had been the opening move in something larger. And she'd just become a piece on a board whose full dimensions she couldn't yet see. Chapter 4: Secrets of the Court. The attack on the Eastern Watchtower had been a diversion. By dawn, that much was clear. 3 assailants, all dead, professional mercenaries carrying no identifying marks. They'd breached the outer wall with explosive charges, engaged the guards for exactly 17 minutes, then retreated toward predetermined positions where Kael'thir's soldiers had cut them down. "They wanted our attention in the east," Captain Mira explained during the emergency briefing. "While we were there, someone attempted to access the archives in the Western Tower." "Attempted?" Kael'thir's voice was dangerously quiet. "Failed." The duty archivist heard movement and sealed the vault before they could enter. Myra's expression darkened. "The archivist died from a crossbow bolt. The intruder escaped." Silvara stood in the corner of Kael'thir's private study, still wearing the same dress from the council session. No one had told her to leave, and she'd learned that observing conversations often revealed more than participating in them. "What's in those archives worth killing for?" she asked quietly. Every head turned toward her. Kael'thas regarded her for a long moment, then gestured to the others. "Leave us." The room emptied rapidly. Only Captain Mira hesitated at the door, receiving a subtle nod from Kael'thas before departing. Once alone, Kael'thas moved to a cabinet and withdrew a crystal decanter. He poured 2 measures of amber liquid, offering one to Silvara. She accepted but didn't drink, examining the glass carefully. "It's not poisoned," Kael'thas said with faint amusement. "If I wanted you dead, there are more efficient methods than recycled tactics." Comforting. Silvara took a cautious sip. The liquor burned pleasantly. Expensive vintage, probably from the coastal vineyards. "You're about to tell me something significant. That's why you dismissed your advisors." "Am I? You sent everyone away, offered expensive wine, and you're studying my reactions with more intensity than during the council session." Silvara met his gaze. "Either you're about to propose something dangerous, or you're determining whether I'm worth the investment you've made." Kael'thas' expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or respect. "The archives contain documentation of noble corruption throughout the Southern Territories," he said finally. "Names, transactions, evidence of treasonous conspiracy. I've spent 3 years gathering proof against those who profit from the Crown's weakness." Silvara's mind raced. "You're building a case. For what? Mass arrests? Political purge? Reform? The king is dying, and his heir is young, easily manipulated. When succession occurs, the corrupt nobility will position themselves as advisors and regents, unless someone provides the new king with ammunition to resist them. And you want to be that someone." Understanding crystallized. "That's why you're fortifying the Northern Territories. You're preparing for the political war that follows." "Partially correct." Kael'thas set down his glass. "I'm also preparing for those nobles to attempt eliminating anyone who threatens their power. Which brings us to your stepfather." The name landed like a physical blow. "Maltherian Vade appears in my archives 17 times, Kael'thas continued. "Fraudulent loans, bribery, conspiracy to commit murder. He's relatively minor compared to some, a jackal feeding on larger predators' kills. But his pattern of destroying rivals through legal manipulation makes him useful to more powerful conspirators." "And I'm evidence of his methods," Silvara said quietly. "House Quenrick's collapse wasn't just personal greed. It was a demonstration of his capabilities to potential employers." "Precisely. Which means he cannot allow you to testify about his techniques. Especially not to someone compiling evidence against his patrons." Silvara's hand tightened on her glass. "The assassination attempt wasn't just about me. It was about the archives. About silencing both threats simultaneously. Your stepfather is many things, but he's not a fool. He knows I purchased you for information, not companionship." Kael'thas' gaze intensified. "What he doesn't know is exactly how much you remember about his operations." "Everything." The word came out harder than intended. "I spent 2 years in his household after my father died. I had access to his study, his correspondence, his meetings. I memorized every detail because I knew someday it would be my only leverage." "Prove it." Kael'thas produced a sealed letter from his desk drawer, breaking the wax to reveal several pages of dense text. "This is intercepted correspondence between Maltherian and an unknown patron. It references the Quenrick transaction but uses coded language." "Decode it." Silvara accepted the pages, scanning rapidly. The handwriting was her stepfather's. She recognized the distinctive slant of his letters, the way he compressed vowels to save space. "It's not a cipher," she said after a moment. "It's legal terminology deliberately misapplied. Here, transfer of agricultural assets means bribing magistrates. Consolidation of territorial claims refers to forging deeds. And this phrase, resolution of inheritance complications." Her voice caught. "That's the euphemism he used when discussing my father's death." The pages trembled slightly in her hands. "He's describing the entire operation. How he poisoned my father slowly enough to mimic natural illness. How he manipulated the grieving household. How he consolidated control before anyone could question the timeline. Kael'ther's expression remained carefully neutral, but his attention was absolute. Silvara forced herself to continue reading, translating the coded language into brutal clarity. By the final page, she'd outlined a conspiracy involving 6 noble houses, 14 corrupt officials, and approximately 200,000 gold crowns in stolen assets. He's not a minor player, she finished quietly. He's the mechanism. The others provide capital and targets. Maltharion provides the methods and legal cover. Can you document this? Write out everything you know with dates, names, and evidence locations.
Yes.
But it will take time, and my testimony alone won't be sufficient. You'll need corroborating evidence, which I have for most of it. What I've lacked is the operational details, the specific techniques used to circumvent legal protections. Kael'ther leaned against his desk. You can provide that. Understanding settled over Silvara like a cloak. That's why you purchased me, not as a wife, as a witness. As an asset, Kael'ther corrected, though marriage provides legal protection. As my wife, you cannot be compelled to testify against me, and your credibility increases. As a purchased slave, you be dismissed as coerced testimony. Efficient. Silvara felt something between admiration and unease. You've thought this through comprehensively. I don't make 2,000 crown investments on impulse. A knock interrupted them. Captain Mira entered without waiting for acknowledgement, a liberty that spoke to her position. My lord, Chancellor Varys, requests an immediate audience. She claims to have information about the archive breach. Kael'ther's eyes narrowed fractionally. Send her in. Varys entered with her usual composed elegance, though Silvara noticed the Chancellor's gaze flicked toward her with poorly concealed irritation. My lord, I've conducted a preliminary investigation into last night's events. Varys produced a slim folder. The duty archivist's movements in the hours before the attack show several anomalies. He accessed restricted sections without authorization and copied multiple documents. You're suggesting the archivist was complicit? Kael'ther's tone revealed nothing. I'm suggesting we cannot rule it out. He may have been selling information before the conspirators decided direct access was preferable. Varys' attention shifted deliberately to Silvara. Of course, the timing is interesting. The attack occurred within hours of new personnel arriving at the fortress. The implication was clear and insulting. Careful, Chancellor. Kael'ther's voice dropped several degrees. Accusations require evidence. Of course, my lord. I merely note the correlation. Varys smiled thinly. Though perhaps Lady Silvara could clarify her movements last evening? After the council session concluded, Silvara met the woman's gaze steadily. I was escorted to my chambers by Captain Mira, where I remained under guard rotation until the alarm sounded. 6 guards can confirm my location continuously. Can you provide similar accounting for your own movements, Chancellor? Color rose in Varys' cheeks. I don't answer to. Actually, a new voice interrupted from the doorway. Everyone answers to someone. The speaker was a young woman Silvara hadn't seen before, perhaps 20, with ink-stained fingers and the distracted air of a scholar. She carried a leather satchel and wore robes marking her as an academic. Archivist Lyron, Kael'ther acknowledged. I understood you were cataloging the damage. I was. And I found something. Lyron approached, extracting a water-damaged ledger from her satchel. The duty archivist, my mentor, left this in a hidden compartment. It's his personal log of archive access requests over the past 6 months. She opened the ledger, revealing columns of dates, names, and document references. 19 unauthorized access attempts, Lyron continued. All denied by proper protocol. But look at who made the requests. Silvara leaned closer. The names read like a roster of Kael'ther's inner council. Varys appeared 4 times. Trade Master Pelion, 6 times. Others she recognized from the morning session showed similar patterns. They were searching for something specific, Kael'ther said quietly.
Yes.
And here, Lyron pointed to a notation in the final entry. My mentor noted, external pressure escalating, requesting consultation. He knew something was wrong, which is why they killed him. Captain Mira said grimly. Chancellor Varys had gone very still. This proves nothing. It proves you lied about the archivist's complicity, Kael'thas interrupted. He died protecting information from people like you. The silence stretched like a blade. Captain Mira's hand moved to her sword hilt. Take her to the holding cells, Kael'thas ordered. Post triple guard. As guards escorted Varys away, the Chancellor's composure finally shattered. You don't understand what you're interfering with. They'll destroy you. All of you. The door closed, muffling her threats. If you're enjoying Silvara's fight for survival, subscribe now. Seriously, you've read this far without hitting that button?
Click. Subscribe. You know you want to.
That evening, alone in her chambers, Silvara found a letter slipped under her door. Unmarked wax. Anonymous handwriting. Lady Silvara, your stepfather sends his regards. He had hoped Ryvek would discard you more quickly. Since subtlety has failed, more direct methods will be employed during the Midwinter Council in 12 days. You cannot protect yourself. Ryvek cannot protect you. The only question is whether your death serves as a warning or an example. Consider cooperation. Your stepfather remains willing to receive you back, humbled, compliant, and alive. You have 7 days to decide. A friend. Silvara's hands trembled as she read it twice. Midwinter Council. 12 days. Maximum chaos. Maximum opportunity for assassination. She looked at the letter again, studying the handwriting, the phrasing, the subtle threats woven through false courtesy. Someone inside the fortress had delivered this. Someone with access to her chambers. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. And in 12 days, surrounded by enemies known and unknown, she would have to survive an attack she couldn't yet predict. The game had just become significantly more deadly. Chapter 5: The Hemeral Conspiracy. The Hemeral Order had a signature. Silvara had learned this during her captivity in Maltherian's household, when she'd overheard whispered conversations about problems being resolved cleanly. The Hemeral were ghosts, elite assassins who left no witnesses, no evidence, and no mistakes. They operated through misdirection, patience, and an almost supernatural ability to blend into any environment. Which was why Silvara noticed the new servant immediately. 7 days had passed since the threatening letter. 7 days of documentation, investigation, and constant vigilance. The fortress buzzed with preparations for Midwinter Council, nobles arriving daily, servants scrambling to accommodate the influx, guards stretched thin managing security. Perfect conditions for infiltration. The servant appeared in the main hall during breakfast, a middle-aged woman with unremarkable features, carrying linens toward the guest quarters. Nothing suspicious about her presence. Except Silvara had memorized the household staff roster, and this woman didn't exist on it. New hire for the council rush? Or something else? Silvara set down her tea and followed at a discreet distance. The woman moved with practiced efficiency, nodding politely to guards, exchanging brief words with other servants. Her behavior was flawless, too flawless. Real servants gossiped, complained about workload, showed fatigue from the increased demands. This woman displayed none of those human imperfections. She was performing the role, not living it. Silvara tracked her through 2 corridors before the woman entered a storage room. Instead of retrieving supplies, she moved to the window, checking sightlines, measuring distances to the courtyard below, surveying assassination vectors. Silvara retreated quickly, finding Captain Mira in the training yard. "We have Hemeral in the fortress," Silvara said without preamble. Mira's expression hardened. "You're certain?" Female servant, mid-40s, brown hair in a braid. Currently in the eastern storage room mapping escape routes. Silvara kept her voice low. "She's not on the household roster, her behavior patterns are wrong, and she's conducting tactical reconnaissance." That could describe a nervous new hire. Nervous new hires don't measure window drop distances with professional precision. Silvara met Mira's gaze. "My stepfather uses the Hemeral Order. They have a method: infiltrate days early, establish cover identities, strike when security is focused elsewhere. I've heard him describe their operations." Mira was silent for 3 heartbeats, then nodded sharply. Show me. They returned to the storage room, but the woman had vanished. Mira examined the window, noting the faint chalk marks on the sill, measurements, exactly as Silvara had described. How many do you think got inside? Mira asked grimly. Hemerl works in teams of 3 to 5. Different roles: reconnaissance, execution, extraction, misdirection. Silvara's mind raced through possibilities. If there's one surveying route, there are other positioning equipment, mapping guard patterns, and identifying targets. We need to inform Lord Ryvek immediately. They found Kael'thir in his war room, reviewing defensive positions with his senior commanders. When Mira explained the situation, Kael'thir's expression went dangerously still. The Hemerl order. His voice was quiet, controlled. Your stepfather hired the best. He doesn't accept failure, Silvara said. After Varys and Corvain were compromised, he escalated to professionals who won't be stopped by increased security. Then we stopped them differently. Kael'thir turned to his commanders. Initiate lockdown protocols. No one enters or leaves without triple verification. Mandatory roster checks for all personnel, cross-reference against hiring records. My lord, one commander objected, with Midwinter Council beginning in 5 days, a lockdown will cause diplomatic incidents. Nobles will interpret it as hostility. Better diplomatic incidents than dead guests. Kael'thir's tone brooked no argument. Execute the order. As commanders dispersed, Kael'thir studied Silvara with that unsettling intensity. You recognized Hemerl methodology from overheard conversations? I recognized it because I studied my stepfather's operations obsessively. Silvara refused to look away. When you're powerless, information becomes your only weapon. I learned everything I could about his methods, his associates, his tools. Including the assassins he kept on retainer. Most people in your position would have focused on survival, not intelligence gathering. Survival requires intelligence. I learned that quickly. Something shifted in Kael'thir's expression, respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred tactical mind. Captain Mira, he said, still watching Silvara. Assigned Lady Silvara a security detail, and give her access to our counterintelligence resources. If she can identify Hemerl operatives, she's our best early warning system. Mira nodded and departed. Alone with Kael'thir, Silvara felt the weight of his attention like a physical force. You're not what I expected, he said quietly. What did you expect? A victim. Someone broken by circumstances, useful for testimony, but requiring constant protection. Kael'thir moved closer, studying her face. Instead, I find someone who weaponizes observation, who turns vulnerability into strategic advantage. You're not surviving despite your circumstances. You're thriving because of how you've adapted to them. Silvara's pulse quickened, though she couldn't entirely identify why. Is that assessment or compliment? Both. And recognition that you're more than an asset. His gaze held hers. Your partner in this war. If you're willing. The word partner resonated unexpectedly. Not possession, not protection, partnership. Equality in purpose, if not yet in power. I'm willing, Silvara said. On one condition. Which is? Complete transparency about the stakes. No more strategic omissions. If I'm risking my life as an active participant rather than a passive target, I need to understand the full scope of what we're fighting. Kael'thir was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Agreed. The full scope, then. A shout interrupted from the corridor outside. Running footsteps. Captain Mira burst through the door, her expression urgent. We found 2 bodies in the lower armory. Guards, throats cut. Professional execution. She handed Kael'thir a small object, a silver coin stamped with an unfamiliar symbol. This was left on one corpse. Silvara's blood went cold. That's the Hemerl calling card. They're announcing their presence. Why announce? Kael'thir examined the coin. Hemerl operate through stealth. They announce when misdirection serves their purpose. Silvara's mind raced through implications. The bodies are in the lower armory, away from guest quarters, away from primary targets. They want security focused there while they position elsewhere. Where? Mira demanded. Silvara moved to the war room's fortress layout map, tracing sight lines and access points. The Midwinter Council convenes in the Great Hall. Too public for assassination, too many witnesses. The feast afterward distributes guests across multiple chambers, harder to secure, easier to isolate targets. You think they'll strike during the feast? Kael'thas asked. I think they'll create chaos during the feast that forces evacuation to predetermined kill zones. Silvara pointed to 3 locations on the map. These chambers offer optimal conditions, limited exits, positioned away from guard concentrations, accessible via servant passages the Hemeril have already mapped. Kael'thas studied the map, then looked at Silvara with new intensity. You're thinking like an assassin. I'm thinking like someone who spent 2 years listening to assassins plan operations. Silvara met his gaze steadily. The Hemeril uses a 3-stage approach: create crisis, force target movement, execute in a controlled environment. If we want to stop them, we need to disrupt one of those stages. Or turn their strategy against them, Kael'thas said slowly. Let them create the crisis, control the evacuation routes, and spring our own trap. Using me as bait, it wasn't a question. Using their expectations against them. They assume you're a helpless target. We demonstrate otherwise. Risky, Captain Mira objected. If our countertrap fails, then I die, which was the plan anyway. Silvara's voice was calm. At least this way, I'm an active participant rather than a waiting victim. Over the next 3 days, they prepared with military precision. Silvara worked with Archivist Lyran to identify all fortress personnel, cross-referencing against hiring records and personal histories. They discovered 2 more Hemeril operatives, a stable hand and a kitchen assistant, both inserted within the past week. Rather than arrest them, Kael'thas ordered discreet surveillance. Let them think they're undiscovered. We need to understand their complete plan. Silvara monitored the operatives' movements, mapping their reconnaissance patterns. The picture that emerged was chillingly professional. The Hemeril had surveyed every critical location, identified guard rotation gaps, and positioned equipment for rapid extraction. Their target was confirmed when Silvara intercepted a coded message being passed between operatives. The Baron rose blooms at midnight's 3rd hour. The message read. Lyran frowned at the phrasing. Poetry? Code. Silvara translated rapidly. Baron Rose is me, a reference to my infertility.
Blooms means to die.
Midnight's 3rd hour is 3 hours after the feast begins, when guests are drunk and security is relaxed. They're confident, Kael'thas observed darkly. They should be. The Hemeril have never failed a contracted kill. Silvara set down the message. Which means we need to be better than their best. On the evening before Midwinter Council, Silvara was reviewing final preparations when a messenger delivered a sealed letter to her chambers. Different handwriting than previous threats. Elegant script on expensive parchment. Lady Silvara, your industriousness is admirable but ultimately futile. The Hemeril cannot be stopped by amateur counterintelligence. However, I write not to threaten but to offer information. Your focus on Maltherian Vade blinds you to larger conspiracies. Lord Kael'thas Ryvek has enemies beyond your stepfather. One particular rival has been working to undermine him for months, someone with resources exceeding Maltherian's considerably. Examine the Western trade agreements negotiated last spring. Note the signatory. Then ask yourself why that noble house would offer such favorable terms to Kael'thas without expecting something in return. The Hemeril is a symptom, not the disease. Trust carefully. A concerned observer. Silvara's hands trembled as she read it twice. Western trade agreements. She'd seen references in Kael'thas' documents, but hadn't examined them closely, focused as she was on her stepfather's conspiracy. She found Lyran in the archives, working late. I need the Western trade agreements from last spring, Silvara said urgently. Specifically the signatory information. Lyran retrieved the documents within minutes. Silvara spread them across the table, scanning for the relevant details.
There.
A comprehensive trade arrangement offering Kael'thas preferential rates, exclusive shipping rights, and military supply contracts. Extraordinarily favorable terms that should have raised suspicions. The signatory was Lord Theron Mervane of Valdres. Mervane, MV. The second conspirator whose identity they'd suspected but never confirmed. But this suggested something far more complex than simple conspiracy. Why would Mervane offer beneficial trade agreements while simultaneously funding assassination attempts? Unless the agreements were the trap. Silvara's mind raced through implications. Trade agreements created dependencies. If Kael'thas relied on Mervane's supply lines, then disrupting those lines could cripple the northern fortress. And if Kael'thas died under suspicious circumstances while dependent on Mervane's resources, the crown would investigate Mervane, Silvara whispered. But Mervane has the trade agreements as proof of cooperation. He'd appear to be a victim of Kael'thas' enemies, not a conspirator himself. What are you talking about? Lyran asked, confused. Silvara looked up, certainty crystallizing. We've been fighting the wrong war. The Hemeril aren't here just to kill me. They're here to kill Kael'thas and make it look like my stepfather's doing. Mervane stays clean, eliminates a rival, and positions himself as the crown's loyal ally in the aftermath. She had to tell Kael'thas immediately. But as she gathered the documents, doubt crept in. The letter's author was anonymous. The theory was speculation. And if she was wrong, she'd be accusing one of Kael'thas' key trading partners of elaborate conspiracy based on circumstantial evidence. Trust carefully, the letter had warned. Who could she trust with this information? Kael'thas himself? Captain Mira? Or was one of them somehow compromised? Tomorrow, the Midwinter Council will begin. Nobles would flood the fortress. The Hemeril would make their move. And Silvara would have to decide who to trust with a conspiracy that threatened everything. The game had just become infinitely more complex. Chapter 6: The Festival of Shadows. Midwinter Council arrived with falling snow and rising tensions. The Great Hall transformed overnight into a spectacle of political theater. Banners representing 17 noble houses hung from vaulted ceilings. Tables arranged in careful hierarchy reflected power dynamics, Crown Prince Aldrich at the head, territorial lords radiating outward in descending order of influence. Kael'thas' position, despite his recent elevation, was respectably close to the center. Silvara stood beside him, acutely aware of every gaze that lingered on her presence. "The barren bride," someone whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Rivek's strategic mistake," another voice agreed. She kept her expression neutral, cataloging faces and alliances. Lord Mervane sat 3 tables away, his elegant features composed in practiced diplomacy. He'd greeted Kael'thas warmly upon arrival, made gracious comments about the fortress's improvements, and hadn't once looked directly at Silvara. Too careful, she thought. He's avoiding acknowledgement deliberately. The council session began with formal pledges of loyalty to Crown Prince Aldrich, a youth of 17 with uncertain eyes and the weight of imminent kingship bearing down on his shoulders. Each noble approached, knelt, and swore elaborate oaths. Silvara watched the ceremony while simultaneously tracking servant movements. 3 individuals matched Hemeril behavioral patterns, the kitchen assistant she'd already identified, plus a wine steward and a guard she hadn't flagged before. 5 operatives total, then. 1 still unidentified. Captain Mira stood positioned near the hall's eastern entrance, her hand resting casually on her sword hilt. Their eyes met briefly. Mira had also spotted the suspicious guard. The political session dragged through territorial disputes, trade negotiations, and succession protocols. Silvara forced herself to pay attention, noting which nobles aligned with whom, which conflicts simmered beneath diplomatic language. Lord Mervane spoke eloquently about unity and cooperation. Several minor houses voiced support for his proposals. A faction was forming, subtle but unmistakable. Then Kael'thas rose to present his anti-corruption documentation. The hall went deathly silent as he outlined systematic fraud, presented evidence of treasonous conspiracy, and named 17 noble houses involved in schemes to undermine crown authority. Chaos erupted. Accusations flew. Nobles demanded to see proof. Kael'thas calmly produced ledgers, correspondence, and testimony that painted a damning picture of coordinated criminal enterprise. Silvara watched Lord Mervane's face. The man's expression remained perfectly shocked, perfectly outraged, but his left hand moved in a subtle gesture beneath the table. A signal. The Hemerald guard near the eastern entrance shifted position, moving closer to the wine steward. They're accelerating the timeline. They're going to move now during the chaos. Silvara leaned toward Kael'thar. They're signaling. Eastern guard and wine steward coordinating. Kael'thar's expression didn't change, but he gave an almost imperceptible nod. The wine steward approached Crown Prince Aldrich's table, offering refreshment with a bow. Standard protocol, except the man's right hand trembled microscopically as he poured. Poison in the wine. They're going to kill the Crown Prince and frame Kael'thar. Silvara stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against stone. Every eye turned toward her. "Forgive the interruption, Your Highness," she said clearly, moving toward Aldrich's table. "But I must insist on a toast before any refreshment is consumed. Northern tradition, the host's lady drinks first to demonstrate hospitality and goodwill." She reached for the Crown Prince's wine cup. The steward's hand moved toward his belt, toward a concealed weapon. Captain Myra's blade was at his throat before the motion completed. "I wouldn't." Guards swarmed the steward. The Eastern Guard bolted for the exit, only to find his path blocked by Kael'thar's soldiers, who'd quietly moved into position during the commotion. "Search them both," Kael'thar ordered calmly. "And test that wine." The steward's belt yielded a vial of concentrated nightshade. The wine, when tested on a laboratory rat archivist Lyran produced from somewhere, killed the animal within seconds. Crown Prince Aldrich had gone pale. "They tried to poison me in my own council." "Not just you, Your Highness." Silvara met his gaze steadily. "They tried to poison you with wine served at Lord Ryvek's table, making him appear responsible. A perfect political assassination. Eliminate the Crown Prince and frame the man presenting evidence against corrupt nobility." "Who ordered this?" Aldrich's voice shook with fury. Kael'thar gestured to the captured operatives. "They're the Hemerald Order. Elite assassins who don't work without substantial payment and clear contracts. Someone in this hall hired them." Lord Mervain stood smoothly. "A horrifying revelation, Lord Ryvek. But surely you don't suggest one of us." "I suggest nothing." Kael'thar's voice cut like steel. "I state facts. The Hemerald were hired, funded, and directed by someone with intimate knowledge of fortress security and council protocols. Someone who's been positioning himself for months through seemingly beneficial trade agreements and diplomatic overtures." "That describes half the nobles present," Mervain countered. "You'll need more specific accusations." Silvara had been watching the room carefully. During the chaos, the kitchen assistant had disappeared, the fifth Hemerald operative, presumably fleeing. But she hadn't gone toward the exits. She'd moved deeper into the fortress, toward the archives. "They're executing a backup plan." "Captain Mira," Silvara said urgently, "the archives."
"Now."
Mira didn't question, simply ran. Kael'thar followed, with Silvara close behind. They reached the western tower to find the archive doors blown open, smoke billowing from inside. The kitchen assistant, revealed now as a Hemerald demolitions expert, stood amid the flames, methodically destroying documents. "Stop," Kael'thar's voice thundered. The woman turned, smiled coldly, and triggered another explosive charge. Silvara tackled Kael'thar sideways as the blast tore through the corridor. Stone shattered. Fire roared. When the smoke cleared, the Hemerald operative had vanished through a hidden passage. "The documents," Lyran gasped, appearing from a side chamber. "She burned everything." "She burned the decoys," Silvara interrupted, helping Kael'thar to his feet. "The real archives are in the sealed vault beneath this level. You told me so yourself 3 days ago." Kael'thar stared at her, then started laughing, a sharp, surprised sound. "You anticipated this." "I anticipated they'd try to destroy evidence. So, I suggested Archivist Lyran create convincing duplicates in the accessible archives while securing originals below." Silvara brushed stone dust from her dress. "Was I wrong to take that precaution?" "You were brilliantly paranoid." Kael'thar's expression held something new, genuine respect mixed with what might have been admiration. They returned to the Great Hall, where chaos had devolved into shouting matches. Crown Prince Aldrich stood at the center, clearly overwhelmed. Kael'thur's voice cut through the noise. "Your Highness, the assassination attempt was coordinated with an attack on my archives. The conspirators sought to kill you, frame me, and destroy evidence of their crimes simultaneously. But they failed," Silvara added quietly, "because their plan relied on assumptions. They assumed I was a helpless target. They assumed the archives were vulnerable. They assumed Lord Ryvek operated without allies capable of strategic thinking." She met Lord Mervain's gaze directly. The man's perfect composure finally cracked, just for a moment, but enough. "They were wrong on all counts," Silvara finished. Crown Prince Aldrich looked at her with new interest. "You orchestrated the countertrap, Lady Ryvek? I anticipated possible moves and prepared contingencies. Lord Ryvek executed the response." Silvara inclined her head respectfully. "We work as partners, Your Highness. Neither of us operates alone." Kael'thur stepped beside her. Not in front, but beside. Equal positioning that wasn't lost on the assembled nobles. "Lady Silvara is my wife, my advisor, and my strategic partner," he said clearly. "Anyone who underestimates her makes a potentially fatal error in judgment." The shocked silence that followed was profound. A woman, a purchased bride, a baron nobody elevated to acknowledged political influence. Lord Mervain's face had gone carefully blank. Around the hall, nobles who dismissed Silvara as irrelevant reassessed with visible calculation. Crown Prince Aldrich spoke into the silence. "Then perhaps Lady Ryvek should explain exactly how she identified this conspiracy. I'm very interested in her analytical methods." Silvara met Kael'thur's gaze. He nodded almost imperceptibly. "Permission. Trust.
Partnership."
She turned to the Crown Prince and began outlining the conspiracy's full scope: Maltherian Vade's operations, Mervain's involvement, the coordinated attack on both crown and evidence. And as she spoke, she watched carefully to see who looked frightened. Because the war was far from over. Chapter 7: Stepfather's Downfall. The interrogation of the captured Hemerald operatives took 3 days. Professional assassins didn't break easily, but Kael'thur's methods were patient and systematic. He didn't torture, he negotiated. Offered reduced sentences, relocation funds, guarantees of safety from retribution. The Hemerald valued survival above loyalty to employers, and one by one, they confirmed what Silvara had already deduced. Maltherian Vade had contracted the assassination. Lord Mervain had provided funding and intelligence. Together, they'd orchestrated a conspiracy designed to eliminate the Crown Prince, destroy Kael'thur's evidence, and consolidate power under corrupt nobility. Crown Prince Aldrich issued arrest warrants immediately. Lord Mervain was taken into custody within hours, his protests of innocence undermined by financial records archivist Lyron discovered linking him directly to Hemerald payment channels. His house would face investigation, asset seizure, and probable attainder. But Maltherian Vade remained in the Southern Territories, protected by distance and a network of corrupt magistrates who owed him favors. "He'll run," Captain Mira predicted during the War Council. "The moment he learns Mervain was arrested, he'll flee beyond Crown jurisdiction. Let him try." Silvara spread documents across the table: correspondence, financial records, testimony she compiled over weeks. "He can run, but he can't hide what he's done. Every corrupt official who protected him is now exposed. Every fraudulent transaction is documented. Every family he destroyed has evidence for restitution claims." Kael'thur studied the documentation with satisfaction. "This is comprehensive enough to pursue him across international borders if necessary. But I'd prefer a more immediate resolution." "I have a suggestion," Silvara said quietly. She outlined her plan with clinical precision. Maltherian's power derived from his reputation as an untouchable legal manipulator. His corrupt allies protected him because he seemed invincible. But that protection evaporated when his methods were exposed, and his powerful patrons fell. "We don't chase him," Silvara explained. "We destroy his foundation and let him collapse." Over the next week, Kael'thur's network moved with coordinated efficiency. Documents detailing Maltharian's crimes were delivered simultaneously to the royal court, the magistrates' council, and every noble house he'd ever defrauded. Silvara's testimony, authenticated by Crown Prince Aldrich himself, provided devastating detail about specific operations. House Quenrick's destruction was laid bare. Lord Vestian, who'd bid for Silvara at auction, discovered his own family had been targeted in a similar scheme years earlier. 3 other houses found evidence their financial difficulties had been manufactured by Maltharian's manipulation. The political response was swift and brutal. Magistrates who'd accepted Maltharian's bribes were arrested. Officials who'd falsified documents were stripped of positions. The entire corrupt network that had enabled his operations for a decade collapsed in days. Maltharian himself tried to flee south toward the coastal cities, but found every route blocked. Harbor masters refused his passage. Innkeepers turned him away. Even his own paid guards abandoned him when the bounty on his head exceeded what he could offer. He was captured attempting to cross the border into Tessarian territories, caught by bounty hunters who delivered him directly to Crown custody. The trial was public, held in the capital with Crown Prince Aldrich presiding. Silvara attended, sitting in the witness gallery with Caelther beside her. Maltharian looked smaller somehow. Stripped of his fine clothing and political protections, he was just a middle-aged man with calculating eyes and a talent for exploitation. He stared at Silvara with undisguised hatred. "Lady Silvara Ryvek," the crown magistrate called. "Please approach." Silvara walked to the witness stand, acutely aware of hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. The courtroom was packed. Nobles, merchants, common citizens, all desperate to see justice served against a man who destroyed countless lives. "Lady Ryvek, you accuse Maltharian Vade of conspiracy, fraud, and murder. Please detail your testimony." Silvara spoke for 2 hours. She outlined every scheme she'd witnessed, every conversation she'd overheard, every document she'd memorized. She described her father's slow death from poison, the systematic theft of her family's assets, the legal manipulations that made it all appear legitimate. Maltharian's attorney tried to discredit her, claiming she was motivated by revenge, that her testimony was coached by Lord Caelther for political purposes. "Is it true," the attorney demanded, "that you were purchased by Lord Ryvek specifically to provide this testimony? That you're a strategic asset rather than a genuine witness?" "Yes," Silvara said calmly. "Lord Ryvek purchased me because he recognized I possessed information about criminal conspiracies. That doesn't make my testimony false. It makes it valuable. But you have personal motivation to see my client punished. I have personal motivation to see justice served. There's a difference." Silvara's gaze found Maltharian across the courtroom. "Your client murdered my father, stole my inheritance, sold me at auction, and attempted to have me assassinated multiple times. Yet I stand here providing documented evidence rather than seeking personal revenge. If I wanted revenge, he'd already be dead." The courtroom went silent. Crown Prince Aldrich leaned forward. "Lady Ryvek, are you threatening the accused?" "No, Your Highness. I'm demonstrating restraint." Silvara turned back to face the magistrate. "I could have hired my own assassins. I could have manipulated situations to ensure Maltharian Vade died quietly. Instead, I chose law, evidence, and public justice. Because, unlike him, I believe the system can work when good people refuse to be corrupted by it." The trial concluded with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all charges. Maltharian Vade was sentenced to complete asset forfeiture, permanent exile from Crown territories, and a life bounty ensuring he could never return. His co-conspirators received similar sentences. The corrupt magistrates who'd enabled him faced prison terms. House Quenrick's stolen assets were ordered restored to Silvara's control, a fortune that made her independently wealthy and politically powerful in her own right. As they left the courthouse, Maltharian's voice echoed across the plaza. "You think you've won. You think this ends anything?" Silvara paused, looking back at the man who destroyed her family. "I don't think this ends anything," she called back clearly. "I know it's only the beginning. You were a symptom, Maltharian. The disease runs much deeper, and I intend to cure it completely." She turned away, ignoring his screamed curses. Kael'thas waited by the carriage, watching her with that intense gaze. "How does it feel?" "Justice achieved, enemy defeated, reputation established." "Incomplete," Silvara admitted. "Maltherion was a tool for more powerful conspirators. Mervain was one, but there are others." "You're certain?" "I'm always certain about patterns." She accepted his hand, entering the carriage. The conspiracy was too elaborate for just 2 architects. Someone else is pulling strings we haven't identified yet. The journey back to the northern fortress took 4 days. During that time, Silvara's reputation transformed from curiosity to genuine political force. Nobles who dismissed her now sent careful diplomatic correspondence. Marriage proposals arrived for hypothetical future alliances, assuming she somehow produced heirs despite medical impossibility. "You've become dangerous," Kael'thas observed, reading through the correspondence. "Half the kingdom fears you, the other half wants to recruit you."
Good.
Fear and interest are better than contempt and dismissal. They arrived at the fortress to find Captain Mira waiting with urgent news. "We've intercepted correspondence," Mira said, handing Kael'thas a decoded message. Encrypted communication between unknown parties discussing the Ryvek problem and eliminating both assets simultaneously. Silvara read over Kael'thas' shoulder. The message was brief, but chilling. Vade's failure demonstrates direct approaches are inadequate. Mervain's exposure confirms external conspiracies are too visible. New strategy required internal corruption, patient development, long-term positioning. The northern consolidation must be prevented, but through methods that cannot be traced to our faction. Recommend Phase 2 protocols. Phase 2, Kael'thas said quietly, implying Phase 1 was everything we've already defeated. And Phase 2 will be more sophisticated. Silvara's mind raced through implications. They're adapting, learning from failures. Whoever this faction is, they're well-funded, patient, and embedded deeply enough to survive exposure to their agents. "Do we have any indication of their identity?" Mira asked. "Only that they refer to themselves as our faction, rather than using names." Silvara studied the message structure. The phrasing suggests multiple houses working in coordination. An alliance rather than a single conspiracy. Kael'thas moved to the fortress map, marking territories and political affiliations. After Mervain's fall, 6 houses abstained from supporting the Crown Prince's justice reforms. They didn't oppose publicly, but they didn't endorse either. Political neutrality that suggests cautious self-preservation. Or coordinated strategy. Silvara joined him at the map. If those 6 houses form an alliance, they'd control approximately 40% of southern trade routes and 30% of crown military contracts. Enough to destabilize the kingdom if they moved simultaneously. Kael'thas' expression darkened. "We've won tactical victories, but the strategic war just escalated." A knock interrupted them. Archivist Lyran entered, carrying a leather folder marked with the crown seal. "This arrived via royal courier," she explained. "Personal message from Crown Prince Aldrich to both Lord and Lady Ryvek." Kael'thas opened it, reading quickly. His eyebrows rose. "The Crown Prince is requesting our presence at court," he said. "Officially, to serve as advisors on anti-corruption reforms. Unofficially." He handed Silvara the letter. She read the final paragraph, written in Aldrich's own hand. "I trust few people in this nest of vipers I'm inheriting. You've proven yourselves capable, honest, and dangerously effective. I need allies who cannot be bought or intimidated. Come to court. Help me clean the rot before it destroys everything. Also, someone is trying to kill me again. Thought you should know." Silvara looked up to find Kael'thas watching her reaction. "The Crown Prince wants us at court," she said slowly, "where we'll be surrounded by the very faction plotting against us, with limited military support and maximum political exposure." "It's a trap," Mira said flatly. "Or an opportunity." Kael'thas' expression was thoughtful. "We can't fight shadows from the northern fortress. At court, we'll be vulnerable but visible. Our enemies will be forced to move carefully or risk exposure. They'll also have maximum opportunity to strike. Silvara met his gaze. This could be exactly what they want, drawing us into controlled territory where they hold advantage. So, we decline the Crown Prince's request. Silvara considered. Declining meant safety, but stagnation. Accepting meant danger, but potential to destroy the conspiracy completely. She thought of her father, dying slowly from poison while corrupt officials looked away. She thought of families like hers, destroyed by systematic exploitation. She thought of a kingdom rotting from within while good people suffered. We accept, Silvara said firmly. But we go prepared for war. Kael'thas smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression. I was hoping you'd say that. You followed Silvara through 7 chapters of survival, conspiracy, and justice. If you haven't subscribed yet, what are you even doing? The faction is plotting. Silvara is heading into danger. Subscribe now or admit you don't actually care what happens next. Your move. Chapter 8. The Shadow Conspiracy Unfolds. The journey to the capital took 6 days through early winter storms. Silvara spent the travel time analyzing intelligence Captain Mira had gathered about court dynamics. 12 major noble houses maintained permanent residences near the palace. 6 had abstained from supporting Crown Prince Aldric's reforms: House Draymore, House Tesserel, House Blackwood, House Corinth, House Ashenvale, and House Silverthorn. Any one of them could be leading the faction, Kael'thas observed, reviewing the same documents. Or all 6 could be working together. Coordinated conspiracy requires central leadership, Silvara said. 6 houses mean conflicting interests, competing egos, and communication vulnerabilities. Someone is orchestrating this. Then we identify the orchestrator and remove them. If only it were that simple. They arrived at the capital to find the palace in controlled chaos. Crown Prince Aldric's father had finally died 3 days earlier. The coronation was scheduled for the winter solstice, now just 2 weeks away. Nobles flooded the city, jockeying for position in the new administration. Captain Mira had traveled ahead to arrange security. She met them at the palace gates with grim news. Your assigned quarters are in the eastern wing, she reported quietly. Isolated location, single entrance, positioned between House Draymore and House Tesserel. They're boxing us in, Silvara observed, limiting our mobility and placing hostile houses on both flanks.
Worse.
The eastern wing has a servants' passage system that connects to all adjacent quarters. Multiple unauthorized access points. Myra's jaw tightened. I've requested alternate accommodations, but the palace chamberlain claims everything else is occupied. Convenient. Kael'thas studied the palace layout map Mira provided. We stay in the assigned quarters, but fortify them. Triple guard rotations, seal the servants' passages, and establish observation posts. Over the next 3 days, Silvara observed court dynamics with systematic precision. House Draymore's patriarch, Lord Cassius, controlled significant military contracts and maintained a private army. House Tesserel, led by Lady Morgaine, dominated the textile trade and had extensive spy networks. The other 4 houses held similar strategic advantages. What interested Silvara was how they moved. Not together, that would be too obvious, but in coordinated isolation. They never met publicly, never spoke at gatherings, yet their political positions aligned with suspicious consistency. They're communicating through intermediaries, Silvara told Kael'thas on the 4th evening. Watch the servants. House Draymore's steward had a brief conversation with House Tesserel's lady-in-waiting this morning. 30 seconds appeared completely innocent, but I saw the steward pass a folded note. Can you intercept their communications? Not without revealing we're aware of the network. Silvara considered alternatives. But I can feed false information through it. She spent the next day carefully positioning herself where faction servants operated. During a palace garden walk, she staged a private conversation with Archivist Lyron, who'd accompanied them to court, ensuring a Draymore servant was within earshot. Lord Rivek suspects House Corinth is leading the conspiracy, Silvara said clearly, though quietly enough to seem secretive. He's planning to present evidence to King Aldric tomorrow during the private council session. Lyron played along perfectly, but the evidence isn't complete yet, which is why he's requesting additional security. If Corinth moves against him preemptively, it will confirm their guilt. The servant disappeared quickly. That evening, Silvara watched carefully. A message passed from Draymore to Tesseril to Blackwood, her false intelligence spreading through the network like poison. Now we wait, she told Caelther. If Corinth isn't the leader, the real orchestrator will make a move to protect them or redirect suspicion. The response came at midnight. Captain Mira woke them urgently. Someone attempted to place documents in our quarters, forged correspondence implicating Lord Ryvek in treasonous conspiracy. Our guards intercepted the infiltrator, but he took poison before interrogation. They're trying to preemptively discredit us. Caelther examined the forged documents. These are professionally done. If they'd been discovered during a security sweep, we'd be arrested before we could present our actual evidence, Silvara finished. She studied the dead infiltrator's clothing. House Silverthorn livery. But they used a Silverthorn servant, not Corinth. They're throwing Silverthorn to us as a sacrifice while protecting the real conspiracy. Or Silverthorn is the real conspiracy, Mira suggested.
No.
Silvara's mind worked through the implications rapidly. Silverthorn is the newest noble house, only 2 generations old, still establishing legitimacy. They wouldn't risk everything on conspiracy. Someone's using them. She returned to analyzing the factions' communication patterns, cross-referencing servant movements, meeting schedules, and political positions. 3 days before the coronation, the pattern finally crystallized. It's not one of the 6 houses, Silvara announced during their private war council. It's someone who benefits from their coordination, but isn't obviously connected. Who? Caelther demanded. The palace chamberlain. Lord Everard Greystone. Mira looked skeptical. The chamberlain is administrative, no military power, limited political influence.
Exactly.
Which makes him invisible. Silvara spread her documentation across the table. He controls palace accommodations, servant assignments, security schedules. Every faction house uses servants from the palace staff pool, servants Greystone assigns. He's the central node in their communication network, but he appears neutral because his position is supposedly apolitical. Caelther studied the evidence with growing certainty. Greystone's family lost significant holdings during the last succession. They were demoted from major house to administrative position. He has a generational motive for destabilizing the crown. And with King Aldrich young and inexperienced, a destabilized court gives Greystone the opportunity to position himself as indispensable administrator. Silvara traced connections on her map. The 6 houses provide resources and political cover. Greystone provides coordination and palace access. Together, they control enough leverage to manipulate the new king. We need proof, Mira said. We need him to reveal himself. Silvara's expression hardened. Which means giving him an opportunity too valuable to resist. She outlined her plan with cold precision. The coronation ceremony would create maximum chaos, nobles focused on pageantry, guards spread thin managing crowds, attention divided between multiple events. Perfect conditions for assassination. We let Greystone believe his conspiracy is undiscovered, Silvara explained. We make Caelther appear vulnerable during the coronation feast. And we prepare to counter whatever move he makes. Using you as bait, Caelther said flatly. Using both of us as bait, but with preparation this time. She met his gaze. You've trusted my strategic analysis, so far. Trust me now. The next 2 days were frantic preparation. Captain Mira coordinated loyal guards in civilian clothing throughout the palace. Archivist Lyron positioned observers near key locations. Silvara memorized floor plans, servant schedules, and emergency protocols. On coronation day, the palace transformed into a controlled spectacle. King Aldrich, no longer crown prince, was crowned in the Grand Cathedral with appropriate ceremony. Nobles pledged loyalty. Priests blessed the succession. Citizens cheered in the streets. The feast afterward filled the palace's great hall with hundreds of guests. Silvara wore a formal court dress, deep green silk that marked her as Lady Ryvek while allowing concealed movement. Caelther stood beside her, playing his role as loyal territorial lord. Lord Greystone moved through the celebration with bureaucratic efficiency, ensuring everything functioned smoothly. He caught Silvara's eye once, smiled politely, and moved on. He thinks we don't know. He thinks we're distracted by pageantry. 3 hours into the feast, Silvara noticed the pattern. Servants from the 6 faction houses were positioning themselves near exits, near King Aldrich's table, near Kael'thar. Not obviously threatening, but strategically placed. Greystone himself stood near the musicians' gallery, elevated position with sight lines across the entire hall. It's starting, Silvara murmured to Kael'thar. When?
Soon.
Watch Greystone's hands. 5 minutes later, Greystone made a subtle gesture, right hand touching his left shoulder. A signal. The musician's music changed tempo slightly. A distraction. A servant approached King Aldrich with wine. Another moved toward Kael'thar. 2 more positioned themselves near the main exits. Silvara's pulse quickened.
Now.
They're moving now. She stepped forward as the servant reached Kael'thar with a wine cup. Allow me to toast first, Northern tradition. The servant's eyes widened fractionally. His hand moved toward his belt. Captain Myra's blade appeared at his throat. Don't. Chaos erupted simultaneously across the hall. The servant near King Aldrich drew a concealed dagger. Royal guards intercepted, but 2 more assassins emerged from the crowd. Faction house nobles moved toward exits, attempting to flee or reinforce. Silvara couldn't tell which. Lord Greystone remained at the gallery, watching with calculated composure, until his eyes met Silvara's across the hall. Understanding passed between them. She knew, he knew she knew, and the game was over. Greystone's hand moved to his belt, drawing a small crossbow concealed beneath his formal robes. He aimed not at King Aldrich, surrounded by guards. He aimed at Kael'thar. Silvara saw the trajectory, calculated the timing, and made an impossible choice. She threw herself sideways into Kael'thar as the crossbow bolt released. Pain exploded in her left shoulder. The impact spun her around, and she collapsed against Kael'thar, blood spreading across green silk. The great hall descended into absolute chaos. Chapter 9. Partnership forged in fire. The crossbow bolt had pierced through muscle and lodged against bone. Silvara heard screaming, distant, muffled, as though underwater. The great hall spun in fragments, Kael'thar's face above her, shouting orders, Captain Mira tackling Lord Greystone from the gallery, guards swarming the faction conspirators, King Aldrich standing frozen in shock. Then hands lifting her, carrying her somewhere. Pain blazed white-hot through her shoulder. Stay with me, Kael'thar's voice, sharp with command. Silvara, stay conscious. She tried to speak, but managed only a gasp. Blood soaked through her dress, warm and sticky. The palace physician's chambers materialized around her. Bright lights. Instruments laid out with clinical precision. Kael'thar holding her hand with crushing intensity. The bolt must be removed, the physician said grimly. It will be excruciating. Do it. Silvara forced the words through gritted teeth. Just do it quickly. The extraction took 7 minutes that felt like hours. Silvara bit down on leather, refusing to scream, while the physician worked with steady hands. When the bolt finally came free, she nearly passed out from relief. Clean wound, the physician announced. No major arteries severed. She'll recover fully with rest. How long? Kael'thar demanded. 2 weeks minimum before. I don't have 2 weeks. Silvara tried to sit up, gasping at the pain. The conspiracy, Greystone's faction, is being rounded up as we speak. Kael'thar gently pushed her back down. Captain Mira has Greystone in custody. King Aldrich ordered immediate arrest of all 6 faction houses' leadership. You've done enough. Have I? Silvara met his gaze. Because conspiracies don't die with arrests. They adapt, regroup, find new leadership. Which is why you need to recover, so we can dismantle them properly. His hand tightened on hers. You took a crossbow bolt meant for me. You could have died.
Yes.
But you're more valuable alive than I am. She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. Your military experience, political connections, relationship with the king. are meaningless without the strategic intelligence you provide. Kael'thar's voice was rough, with emotion she'd never heard before. You calculated Greystone's network. You identified his methodology. You orchestrated the countertrap. I would have walked into that feast blind and died in the first minutes. Silvara was quiet, processing this admission. You're saying I'm valuable. I'm saying you're irreplaceable. He stood, still holding her hand. Rest. When you wake, we finish this war together. She slept for 16 hours. When consciousness returned, she found herself in luxurious quarters, not the Eastern Wing's isolated rooms, but chambers clearly designated for high nobility. Archivist Lyron sat nearby, reading medical texts. You're awake, Lyron said with obvious relief. How's the pain? Manageable. Silvara sat up carefully, testing her shoulder's range of motion. What happened while I slept? Greystone confessed everything under interrogation. All 6 faction houses were arrested, their assets frozen pending trial. Lyron's expression was grim. But there's more. The conspiracy extended deeper than we thought. 17 additional noble families were providing financial support, expecting positions in the new administration after King Aldrich was manipulated. 17. Silvara absorbed this. We've decapitated the conspiracy, but haven't destroyed its infrastructure. Exactly what Lord Ryvek said. He's been working with King Aldrich for the past day, coordinating a comprehensive purge. Silvara dressed with Lyron's assistance, ignoring protests about rest. Her shoulder throbbed, but her mind was clear. She found Kael'thar in the king's private council chamber, surrounded by maps and documentation. King Aldrich looked up as she entered. Lady Ryvek, you should be recovering. With respect, Your Majesty, I'll recover better knowing the kingdom is secure. Silvara approached the table, scanning their work. What's the current status? Kael'thar detailed the arrests, asset seizures, and preliminary interrogations. The conspiracy had been vast, nearly a quarter of the kingdom's nobility involved to varying degrees. We can't arrest everyone, King Aldrich said wearily. It would destabilize the entire realm. We don't need to arrest everyone, Silvara replied. We need strategic prosecution that demonstrates consequences while offering redemption to minor participants. She outlined a tiered approach: harsh punishment for leadership, moderate consequences for active conspirators, and clemency for those who'd been coerced or marginally involved. Combined with systematic reforms to prevent future corruption, it would reshape the kingdom's power structure. King Aldrich listened with growing respect. This is remarkably comprehensive. Lady Ryvek specializes in comprehensive strategy, Kael'thar said quietly. Which is why I'm recommending she be appointed royal advisor for internal security. Silvara's head snapped toward him. What? The position requires someone who understands conspiracy, can anticipate threats, and possesses the analytical capacity to dismantle corruption systematically. Kael'thar's gaze held hers. You're the only person qualified. I'm a woman, a former slave. Nobles will never accept. Nobles will accept what I command them to accept, King Aldrich interrupted. His young face was set with unexpected steel. You saved my life twice. Once by identifying the poison wine, again by exposing Greystone's conspiracy. Your gender and history are irrelevant compared to your capability. Over the next week, Silvara coordinated the conspiracy's systematic dismantling. Working with King Aldrich's authority and Kael'thar's military resources, she orchestrated arrests, confiscated assets, and restructured corrupted institutions. She implemented oversight protocols, transparency requirements, and accountability measures that transformed how the kingdom's administration functioned. Nobles who dismissed her as Kael'thar's purchased ornament were forced to recalibrate. She conducted interrogations with precision that extracted information professional inquisitors missed. She identified secondary conspirators through pattern analysis. She negotiated plea agreements that turned conspirators into witnesses. Within 10 days, the conspiracy was effectively destroyed. The formal announcement came during a public court session. King Aldrich stood before the assembled nobility, Kael'thar and Silvara positioned at his right hand. Lady Silvara Rivek has demonstrated extraordinary service to the crown, Aldrich declared. Through her intelligence, courage, and strategic brilliance, she has protected this kingdom from those who would destroy it. Therefore, I hereby appoint her royal advisor for internal security, with full authority to investigate corruption and implement reforms. Shocked silence, then scattered applause that gradually built to something approaching genuine respect. Lord Cassius Draymore, arrested, tried, and facing execution, shouted from his chains. She's a barren woman, an ex-slave. This is an abomination. She's the reason you're still breathing instead of dead from a secret assassination. Kael'ther's voice cut across the hall like a blade. She could have arranged your death a dozen ways. Instead, she chose law and justice. That demonstrates more nobility than your entire corrupt bloodline possessed. The applause intensified. That evening, alone in their private chambers, Kael'ther poured 2 glasses of wine. To survive, he said quietly, offering her one. Silvara accepted. To partnership. They drank in comfortable silence. I need to tell you something, Kael'ther said finally. When I purchased you at that auction, I believed I was acquiring a strategic asset. Information wrapped in testimony, useful for destroying my enemies. I know. You were very clear about that. I was wrong. He set down his glass. You're not an asset. You're not a tool. He paused, choosing words carefully. I trust no one. It's kept me alive through a dozen wars and 100 political betrayals. But I choose you because you see what others cannot. You calculate angles I miss. You anticipate threats I overlook. Silvara felt something warm unfold in her chest. You're saying you trust me. I'm saying I choose to trust you, which is infinitely more deliberate. His gray eyes held hers. Trust is a decision, not a feeling. And I decide, every day, that you are my partner. My equal. Not because circumstance forced it, but because you've earned it. She was quiet for a long moment. I was sold at auction like livestock. Purchased for 2,000 gold crowns. Every noble in this kingdom knows I'm barren, knows I was bought, knows I can never provide you heirs. And yet you've provided something more valuable. A partnership based on capability rather than bloodlines. Kael'ther moved closer. I don't need heirs. I need someone who can rule beside me, who can see threats and opportunities, who can transform kingdoms through strategy rather than violence. That's a radical redefinition of queenship. Then perhaps queenship needed redefining. His hand found hers, careful of her injured shoulder. The old model was women as breeding stock and political ornaments. You've demonstrated a new model, women as strategic equals, valued for intelligence rather than fertility. Silvara felt tears threatening, forcing them back. You realize this will change everything. Not just for us, but for how nobility views marriage, power, gender. Good. The old system was corrupt and failing. Kael'ther's voice was firm. We'll build something better. Together. She leaned against him carefully, mindful of her shoulder. Together. Outside their window, the capital city spread beneath winter stars. A kingdom saved from conspiracy, reshaped by unlikely partnership between a purchased bride and a northern lord. Silvara thought of her father, of House Quenrick's destruction, of standing on that auction block calculating survival. She'd survived. More than survived, she'd transformed survival into power, vulnerability into strategy, helplessness into influence. What are you thinking? Kael'ther asked quietly. That I've come very far from that auction block. You were always this person. Circumstances simply hadn't revealed it yet. Maybe. Silvara smiled slightly. Or maybe I became this person because circumstances demanded it. Either way, she looked up at him. I'm grateful you saw potential where others saw damaged goods. I saw intelligence, determination, and survival instinct. Everything else was negotiable. His hand tightened on hers. What do you want now? Real question, honest answer. You've secured position, wealth, influence. What's next? Silvara considered. I want to dismantle every system that enables people like Maltherian. I want to restructure how power functions in this kingdom so that what happened to my family can never happen again.
She paused.
I want to transform survival into justice. For everyone. Ambitious. You asked for honesty. I did. Kael'thas smiled, genuine warmth she'd rarely seen. Then that's what we'll do. Transform survival into justice. Reshape the kingdom. Build something better than what we inherited. Together. Always together. They stood at the window, watching the kingdom they'd saved and would now reshape. No longer lord and purchased bride. No longer a strategic asset and calculating owner. Partners. Equals. A new kind of power forged in fire and conspiracy. The future was uncertain, full of threats they couldn't yet identify. But Silvara had learned that uncertainty was simply another puzzle to solve, another pattern to analyze, another challenge to overcome. And this time, she wouldn't face it alone. If you've read this entire story without subscribing, I genuinely don't know what to tell you. Silvara went from auction block to royal advisor. She took a crossbow bolt and dismantled a kingdom-wide conspiracy.
Subscribe.
Support stories about brilliant women who refuse to stay victims. Click the button.
Do it now.